I've said in the past that theology and the Bible and Christianity is not tidy, and some things are tidier than others, but one of the most untidy aspect of our Christian thinking and understanding and theology has to do with the opening chapters of Genesis. And part of the reason it's untidy, I think, is, well, there's a couple of reasons. One of them is people in ancient times communicated differently than we communicate today. Moses wrote Genesis 1500 BC. That's 3,500 years ago. Okay, that's a long time ago. There were different methods or sensibilities about recording events that they had then than they do now. Even 2,000 years ago when the Gospels were written, sometimes we get a little bit upset when things don't seem to be in the same chronological order from one gospel to the other. Well, that's because people writing those accounts, even though they were writing historical accounts and not just making up mythological stories, they didn't care about the chronological order as much as they did as the thematic order. And so even people doing biographical historical things were free in the context of their writing back then to shift some things around a little bit to make a point. And this wasn't considered deceptive, or it wasn't considered an error, all right? It was a different way of writing. And the same thing you have with Genesis. Some people have tried to look at Genesis, for example, and say, and do what they call a concordist look. And they are trying to match up the particular details of Genesis with something that if they were there at the time, they would have seen happening. And you have old earthers and young earthers that are concordists. So the young earthers might be a Ken Ham, Answers in Genesis approach. Old earther would be a Hugh Ross, or Reasons to Believe kind of approach. Very, very different approach, but they're both concordists. They are trying to read a progressive history in those texts. What if it turns out that those texts were not meant to be read that way? What if they have a different purpose, a different theological purpose, considering the ancient Near Eastern cosmologies? And there was a different point of view that's being expressed. And I know some people will say, well, look at the words, and it says a day, and it says this, and morning and evening. And that's could be because you guys are reading it the way a 20th century person is reading an account instead of reading it the way the persons who lived at that time would have been reading it, okay? I'm not cashing in on any side of this. I'm just saying these are the reasons why there's some confusion here. So the specific question is, how do I deal with the animal death, for example, given Genesis 1? Now, I guess the presumption there is that Genesis 1 teaches that animals did not die until after the fall. Well, that's not at all clear to me, just on a straightforward reading of the text, that animals did not die before the fall. Now, I think people can maybe infer that from something Paul wrote in Romans talking about the fall. That would be Romans chapter 5. And they might be understanding Paul to be meaning that there was no death of any kind, or at least no sentient death or no creaturely death. Maybe plants died, but no creaturely death until after the fall, and therefore all the animals would not have died prior to the fall. And if you're an old earther, that's a problem, right? Because animals did die before the fall on an old earth view. So that seems like the old earthers at odds with the scripture. All I have to say about that is I don't see in Genesis 1 where it says animals didn't die before the fall, and I can see an interpretation of Romans 5 which would bring somebody to that conclusion, but that isn't what Paul says either, because Paul isn't talking about all creatures. He is talking about human beings, and he's talking about the first Adam and the second Adam and human death and human life and salvation and the like. He is not addressing the question of animal death in the passage. It may be that he is referring to all creatures when he says death came in through one man, or it may mean that his death that he has in view there is the death pertaining to the subject he's discussing, which is men. You cannot be dogmatic based on what Paul says, because Paul does not claim that animal death happened after the fall. If he did, then countless numbers of theologians would not hold to animal death before the fall, but they feel comfortable doing so because Paul's teaching does not preclude it, and well-justified information from an examination of the natural world seems to indicate that there were animals dying before man was even on the earth. That seems to be reasonable, and it doesn't seem to me by itself to cause any theological problems. Now, there are other questions that need to be answered, and I know people do things with genealogies there in the book of Genesis. Keep in mind that genealogies, Hebrew genealogies, are wildly incomplete, and all the other examples that we have of Hebrew genealogies, like at the beginning of the Gospels, etc., Matthew, I think, it shows that they're incomplete. That was not their style to be complete. In any event, there are a lot of questions regarding these things. And I'm not here going to campaign for one side or another. Some of you know what my view is. I think that there are a number of different ways of understanding Genesis 1 that one can legitimately hold, even non-concordist views, that one can legitimately hold and maintain a high view of Scripture, like inerrancy, and also a high view of the cross and salvation. And I think it's kind of interesting that this issue was never really even discussed until really modern times. So the early church did seem to care about that. Augustine, one of the great saints and thinkers of the church, was, from all we could tell, what would be considered now an old earther. And that didn't seem to undermine his own robust theology of the cross and the sovereignty of God. So I think there are different alternatives, and the best thing for us to do is do our best thinking and do our best work, be responsible for our own views, and be charitable to those who disagree, so that we model charity in the midst of this kind of discussion that is, and here I am somewhat dogmatic, about non-essentials. This particular discussion is about non-essentials. When it gets to the fall of man, chapter 3, that's different. Was there an Adam? Did he fall from original innocence? That's huge. That is Romans 5 stuff. But not this issue of the animal death, or how much time has actually passed. That's different. To each his own, and let's knock it out in a gracious way and figure out what we think is actually true, given all of the evidence.